Okay, before we get to mark stitch the panels that we have cut out, I would like to briefly explain to you what it is that we're going to mark stitch and why we are mark stitching it. Very simple. We have a pattern. We lay this pattern on the fabric. We then trace around this pattern, and we also mark the information pieces that we have on the pattern, like pockets, balance lines, darts, buttons, and anything else. However, there is a problem. And the problem is that we have only marked on one side of the fabric. So what we do is we mark stitch through all the layers of the fabric so that we can get these lines transferred on every single side. This way, when we are working separately on each panel or pattern piece, we know that what we're doing on one side is going to be exactly the same on the other. That's the very basic purpose of mark stitching. So let's move on. Okay, so let's start with the forepart, and before I'm going to mark stitch this, I'm just going to press it flat so that all these layers are just sitting on top of each other without any differences in length. Because this is linen, I don't spray this because linen sometimes stains. So a steam iron would be fine. You know, you could use a pressing cloth just to be on the safe side. And other than that, a dry iron would do the trick for now. So before you do any mark stitching, make sure that you know, by just using the tip of your fingers, you move the fabric around so that you really align the edges nicely and that you don't have, you know, a mismatch in terms of the contours. Then after that, once you've done that, make sure that all lines are visible, and if there are any lines that are kind of like fading out, be aware of them or just remark them again, because sometimes that does happen. Now, what are we going to mark stitch on the forepart? Very simple. First of all, the outer edges. So we have the armhole, shoulder, gorge, and then we go into the lapel, edge of the lapel here, front edge, and into the bottoms. After that, the most important thing is our balance line. So we have the chest, waist, and hip. Now, chest is the most important one, then is the waist, which is secondary, and the hip is tertiary. So the hip is, you know, you don't often see people mark hip lines, but I'm going to do this so that when we look at the garment, we can reference things back and forwards and just make better observations. So after you've done the edge of the pattern and you've done the balance marks, the third important thing is the center of the dart. Once you've done the center of the dart, we have the tip of the dart, the widest point of the dart, and the bottom of the dart. After that, we have the pocket mouth. Now, you don't see a flap marked out here or a patch pocket. You can have that. I've just left it out so that I'm actually going to mark it with you so that you know if you didn't have it, how you would mark it. Then we have the outbreast. Again, I've marked this, but I should have left it out. I'm still going to talk you through how to do that. But we have the outbreast, which we're going to mark. And then we have our first button, or second or third if we have any, and the break line. So let's get started. What's important is that any area that you're going to be sewing with your hands, for example, shoulders or sleeves or armholes, don't do the mark stitches too far away from each other. Even though it's a straight line and you can connect, you know, one end to the other with a ruler, fabric distorts and moves around more than you ever think. So it's good to have shorter distances so that in case, you know, because of the handling, any of these stitches come out, you don't end up with, you know, in no man's land, as they say. So that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes you may want to pin something down if it moves too much, but make sure that when you are pinning something down, you don't create excess length. You know, you don't have a bubble on the top layer or a bubble underneath. And really make sure that everything is, you know, flat and smooth so that, you know, you don't end up with differences in length. Because sometimes you mark stitch something and then you notice that, oh, this break line is longer than the other one, or, you know, this jacket is longer than the other one. And you end up, you know, spending time in trying to find out what the cause is of that, and you're just wasting your time. So just be prepared. Now also make sure that when you're marking those corners, just as I showed you in the video for how to do a mark stitch, you really get the corners and the points of the corners, because without them it's going to be a bit tricky to navigate yourself, especially when you're doing a lot of fabric manipulation. For example, if you're doing a pagoda shoulder, you really want to know where every point is and where you are. If you want, you can sometimes put weights on your forepart so that it doesn't move, but that's optional. If you're in control of what you're doing and you're aware of every movement, then you may not need to do that. Now the other thing is, make sure you remember that you have to keep your bites fairly small. We don't want to have very big bites, because what's going to happen is that if you have a big bite, then your mark stitch is going to come out a lot quicker than it normally would do. As I get to the lapel, I make the distance between my stitches just a little bit longer, because I won't be doing too much on the lapel edge for now if I want to make the base fitting, because the lapel edge just gets folded over, so I'm not going to be touching that too much with my fingers. You can also, by the way, snip these threads with any kind of scissors that you have. Just make sure that they are sharp and that you're comfortable with them. The reason why I use this for mark stitching, first of all, it has a round point, so it doesn't kind of like cut into the fabric that easily. Also, they are curved, so when I'm opening the layers up, I can kind of like really get into the areas that are difficult to reach. So and it's a bit longer, so I don't need to really get too close, and therefore sometimes accidentally catch some of these threads. Those snips, those small snips people hold in their hands and they snip like that. I'm not a fan of those, because you can just pull mark stitches out sometimes, or they're very sharp as well, and sometimes you can cut through the fabric. Again, with the front edge, I just continue to keep my distance about inch and a quarter, and as I get around this curve, I obviously do my stitches closer to each other. Now, sometimes, it's obviously better to just do one continuous line, but if I want to continue here, I'm going to make awkward movements with my hand, and so I would like to keep my hands like so. So if I'm sewing, I'm not sewing like this, I'm sewing more like that, because that gives you more control. So what I do here is I just go from the other side. However, if you do that, make sure you're not pushing anything into there and you're trapping fabric in there. So just be conscious about your needle technique and how you're working with the fabric. Now, if you're doing anything like a button, let's say, that is a short line and a short marking, I think what's best to do is just to do like 3 or 4 mark stitches very close to each other, so that if one of them gets lost, because you do fittings and you pull around the button area, the customer is going to pull around the button area. You don't want that area to kind of like get lost. Although it's not a big deal, but you definitely need to know where the button area is if you're working on your bridle, which we're going to talk about later, or your break line or your facings. And so you don't want to end up with one button positioning lower than the other, and so the lapel rolling lower or higher than the other panel. You want to keep things as symmetrical as you can. Now, does it matter which order you start? Like, do you need to start with the chest line or the outer edges or whatever? There really isn't any difference, as long as things don't move around while you're sewing and you don't forget any lines. You can start from any point. Probably it's best to start with the lines that have faded the most. other than that, it's not really a big problem, I would say. Now sometimes if you're short on thread here, what you can do is you can just pull a little bit, shorten these ones, so you gain a little bit more on this side. You also may notice that some of the foreparts have the side body attached on them. And so instead of having a underarm seam or a side body seam around here, they just have a dart. If you're wondering how to deal with that, I would say treat that dart just like any other dart. Mark a line in the center of it, mark the tip of it, the widest point, and the center line. And mark stitch that so that you can sew it later on. It's very simple. It's nothing difficult, really. Now here I do them slightly bigger because I usually immediately start to sew the dart once I've taken the mark stitches or the two layers apart. So if you see that these are a bit bigger, don't be confused. So we have the center of the dart, then we have the tip of the dart, and I've explained all of this in the how to do a mark stitch video, and if you want to look at that, you can just go over that. It's a lot shorter, and it's exactly the same principle that I'm following now. So I have a horizontal one now to create a cross there and a cross in the center, and of course we have the pocket mouth. If you're mark stitching your balance marks, make sure you don't start here. Start very close from the edge so that you always have them around when you're trying to match your panels together. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit more difficult. And here again, sometimes you know people only mark stitch up until here, but I would like to do everything so I can really have that horizontal chest line reference that I discussed earlier with you, and make sure that everything is as it should be. It's not always obvious when you're doing something wrong, even if you've been doing it for 700 million years. Some fabrics are deceiving. They are not showing off their grain. They are stretchy. They hide mistakes, and they hide, cutting mistakes, making mistakes. So you want to make sure that whatever you do, you can tell it is technically sound and technically correct. What the style is and whether the style is nice or not so nice, that's something else. That's what you developed as you developed your sense for, proportions and lines and shapes and colors and, the character of the person who you are making things for. But the first thing you have to worry about is to be technically correct. Also, when you get used to things, so for example, you've made a couple of jackets, you know what you're doing, you know how you want to have your jetted flap or the flaps for your jetted pockets and your out breast and everything else. So in that case, you start to simplify things even more. So instead of mark stitching the entire out breast, you only mark stitch really the pocket mouth, or you only mark stitch, like I've done here, the pocket mouth, or you're not going to do a lot of lines that are excessive. So as for now, I'm mark stitching the entire out breast. I'm making sure I have all the corners there so that we can look at it if we have to, and have good reference points. Now you can see how easily this can get very messy. If you have your threads too long or you leave them in, you cannot work like this. So eventually you have to trim them down because everything will come out. Another thing that I would like to mention is that you notice that we have a square lapel here. And as I mentioned, we're going to do a peak lapel as well. But since we're going to first go through the fitting process, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's a square lapel or a DB lapel. As long as we have enough fabric for that, then when we get to cut the front edges, that's when we really decide to make it into a peak lapel or a square lapel, or, you know, even no lapel if you don't want a lapel. So if you're making a Nero jacket, then you know, you don't have lapels. I've gone through all the lines. I just need to do the pitch mark, and then I'll discuss what we're going to do. If you want to know what needle I'm using a number 5 needle, which is bigger than you know, the average needle that I'm using. I usually use a number 7, but you know, if I'm basting anything or I'm doing, you know, mark stitching or canvassing, I slightly use a bigger needle. So we've now done all the lines. What you have to now keep in mind is a couple of things. Before you cut anything open, flip your panel on the other side and just examine every single thing that you've been mark stitching, and to see if all the lines are there. So we have our, you know, our hemline, then we have our front edge that goes into the lapel. Fine. Also, pay attention to every single corner that you have mark stitched. So you have a corner on the shoulder, a corner on the shoulder and neck point. You have corner around your pockets, the dart. Make sure that everything is visible. You also notice that the bites that I have are no longer than 1/8, which is about 3 millimeters. If you have them too big, they will catch and they just easily, you know, come out. So once everything looks fine, then continue. I can see that there is a stitch here that I'm not really happy with, so I'm just going to take it out and redo that and make sure that I have an intersection here. So where the gorge line runs into the lapel, the break line runs through it. You would want to mark that as a cross so that you have a definite point for where the gorge intersects with the break line. So now just double check. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do, obviously, like you know, is we're going to cut things open. Now, to cut things open is probably better for me to film it in a different way. So let's get on it. Right. So if we want to kind of like open this up, it's better to start from the outer edges, you know, where you have the longest line, usually the front edge, and then work your way inwards. So let's start just going through that. All you have to do is just to open it up slightly so that you leave just a little bit of thread, about maybe 2 or 3 millimeters long, into the fabric. Be very careful not to cut your fabric because it will happen. And if it's your own project, then that's fine. But if it's someone else's and, you know, it's for the company you're working for, you may have to order new fabric if it's on a place where you cannot, you know, hide it in the seam or whatsoever. So now that you've, you know, done all the mark stitching, feel free to kind of like turn things to your own, you know, to your side, and make sure that it's very visible what you're doing. Don't mark stitch the other way around. So don't try to, you know, work from this side, you know, because you're not, this is covering your view. You can't really see what you're doing. It's very dangerous. So always open it so that it's facing you and it's opening away from you. That's the least dangerous way of cutting through these threads. Another thing that I could mention is always try to open up the fabric so that the horizontal thread is facing you. Don't try to open up the fabric in the direction of a vertical line, because what's going to happen is you're going to kind of pull the threads out by accident, and it's not really going to be pleasant once you've mark stitched things to take them out and redo them again. Okay, so once you've done everything and you've cut through all the layers or all the threads in between the layers, just move this around so gently so that you can see if any area has got stuck. Because if you've forgotten, let's say, a line and you just, take this apart, then boom, all your lines go and you have to do it again. And it's really to re-mark stitch something or a line when the rest is already mark stitched. It's very difficult to get that accurate. So once you've done that, what you're going to do is to trim everything that you have to a length of roughly 2 to 3 millimeters. Another reason why I like this scissors is that I can work on it, and trim things horizontally if I have to. So let's just trim some of this away. Okay, once you're done, you can either throw it on the floor or do what I like to do is I just put it on my board like so. Just gently move around to the left and right. Once you've done that, you can easily grab them together. And once the majority of them are gone, you can just use your lint roller to get rid of them. Especially if you're working from home and you don't want the entire house to be covered with mark stitches, it's probably better to do that, but whatever. Now some of them are still long enough, so I have to shorten those as well, and just double check that I don't leave any threads that are too long. What you need to do, and that's probably the best practice to make a habit of, is to expose these mark stitches to steam. Now heat alone will not do the trick, it has to be steam. So if this was a wool, for example, I would just spray some water on top of it, or if you have a steam iron, just steam over it. My steam iron is not with me at the moment, so what I would do instead is the following. I would take my spray bottle and just do a light mist on the board. Quickly move sideways to get rid of that excess droplets. Lay this on top and start pressing. There is already steam coming up my board. I'm not sure whether that's visible in the video, but going like that over the panels with the iron is going to allow more steam to kind of like get into the fibers of these mark stitches, and that's going to help them to grip the yarns a lot better and therefore stay there longer. So now I'll just do the other side as well. And the good thing about linen is it allows heat to go through very quickly. So the layer underneath gets very hot as this one is getting hot as well. So you don't need to really wait for your board cloth to get hotter and hotter to release that steam. Cool. So that was our forepart. Now we can move on to the next panel, which is the side body. Again, before I start, I'm just going to give this a press. Now, on our side body, we're going to have a side vent. So we allow extra fabric here at the bottom of the side body so that by the time, let me just demonstrate this to you, so that by the time, let's say this is our vent inlay, this is going to get folded over, so that by the time the back covers it and opens up on the vent, you don't see your trouser. This is going to be acting as a shield. So that's why we allow extra fabric for the side vent on the side body. Okay, let's get started. Now the lines that we have on our side body are very simple. We have the armhole, we have the top of the side body, or top of the side seam, so sometimes they call it. We have the side seam, we have the hem, hip line, waistline, chest line. Now sometimes I leave a little bit of inlay around here, but because this is a pattern that I have used before, I didn't leave in any inlay. So if I want to sew this seam, all I have to do is go measure a seam allowance back from the edge. So normally that's 3/8 or a centimeter, and then just machine a seam allowance away from the edge. Whereas here, where we have the inlay, I still have the edge of the pattern here that I'm going to mark stitch, but there is seam allowance included on this pattern. So what I would do, instead of sewing on this line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to again mark a seam allowance away from the edge of the pattern and sew behind that. It's a very general practice that we do as tailors. We don't like to sew on top of our mark stitches because, you know, they come out and it's not really pleasant. So you always, you know, have the edge of the pattern marked, and then you sew a seam allowance behind the mark stitches. The only area that I know of that we normally don't do that is the center back and the hem. So we don't fold a seam behind the hemline. We just fold it right on the mark stitches. But the side seams usually have the seam allowances included. So are the shoulder seams and the armholes. Now let's get started. Another thing that I would like to mention is that once you've mark stitched the majority of your pattern, don't be afraid to just flip it over and, you know, have it so in front of you that you are sewing just a horizontal line. You've already, you know, these are held in at these places, so nothing is going to move anymore. Now, sometimes I see people, they are trying to mark stitch and they don't want anything to move. It's like you've mark stitched 99% of it. So there's only a couple of lines that you need to mark stitch. You can perfectly move those panels now because nothing is going to move. Again, you can, you know, now open up the panels. If you want to do this, you can also expose the threads to steam before you cut them open. But if you're careful, you know, there isn't really any difference between that. So I'm going to go ahead and start opening these panels. So that's for the side body. Now let's move on to the next part, which is the back. Okay, so before we start mark stitching the back and sewing up the center back, what I want you to focus on is the vents, because I want you to understand what we need to do with them when we are mark stitching them and how to deal with everything else when it comes to the side vent or the center vent. Now, let's start with the side vent. If you look at this edge here, we have the edge of the pattern. That's the edge of the side seam. Then this edge continues as a line, as a chalk line, all the way down to the very bottom. Next to this line, we have a strip of fabric, which is the inlay for the side vent. And this is put on so that we can fold this over and create our vent. Now, the area that you need to mark stitch can be the continuation of the edge of this pattern, like so. But the real mark stitch that you really are going to need is a seam behind, 3/8 or 1 centimeter behind this line, like the one I've drawn here. Why is that? Very simple. Since this is the edge of the pattern, if we are going to sew this panel to the side seam, we are going to measure 3/8, which is our seam allowance, away from the edge of the side seam here, and we're going to sew along this edge and continue all the way down. And you see the second line, which is a seam away from the edge of the pattern, is that line where we need our mark stitches. Because once you've sewn all the way down, when you press your seam allowances open, the crease line of your vent should be a continuation of the sewing line, not the edge of the pattern. If you crease the edge of the pattern, what you then get is this. It should go a seam away. So you don't want to get distortions here, because the closer you get, you get this weird twist going on, and that's not really good. So the crease line of your side vent is the continuation of the sewing line of the side seam. After that, let me just press this again. We're going to look at the center vent. Now, the center vent is not confusing at all, but it's always explained in a very confusing way, and you are going to be afraid of working around it. It's very simple. So let's just talk about first how a vent functions. A vent is basically when you have two panels. Let's say we're looking at the back panel now. Imagine this is sewn up and pressed. If you look at this panel, we have an opening here, which is our vent. The vent is not sewn, it's just a crease that can open up. Okay? Now, the side that covers the other side, let's say in our case it's the left side over the right side. The left side, which is the one on the top, needs less fabric on the inside because it's going to get covered with lining pretty much all the way to the edge. Whereas the layer underneath, the panel underneath, needs to have more fabric so that when this opens up, it covers the seat of the trouser. So, therefore, if we look at it from the top, we have a narrower back on the left panel, and we have a wider back on the right panel. The way this is going to work is the following. How do you cut this, and how do you know how to cut this and how it should be? Well, I hate to give you measures because I want you to understand the principle of every concept that we are discussing, but I think maybe measures make it simpler. So, if you want to know how do I position my back so that I get the right amount while having this on the fold, this is what you're going to do. You're going to decide what the total of your inlay is going to be in the vent area. So in my case, we have, let's say, this strip of about 1 inch, and if we measure from this line all the way to this edge, that's about 5 inches. So a total of 6 inches. Divide that by 2, and in our case, you have 3. In your case, it may be a different number, but the total of the inlay for both panels in the vent area divided by 2, that number is the distance between your folded edge and the center back of your pattern. I hope that makes sense. So now you can see that, I mean, I've already cut this, but if this was on the fold, this wasn't cut. So what you then have to do is, first of all, double check which one is the one that needs the most fabric. So if you position them like that and you fold them over as if you've been sewing them, when you lift this one up, you're like, okay, this is the left vent over the right. So I need this to be smaller, narrower. I need less inlay here. You decide how much inlay you want there. Let's say in our case, 1 inch. And now you also know that the bottom layer is the one that has the shield, which covers the seat of the trousers. So when you flip this over, you know that you're looking at the top layer, which needs less inlay. That's why you draw this line that I've cut on the top layer. Then you cut along that line. So we have now 1 inch going all the way down as inlay, and the rest can open up like so and function as that shield. So if this was a vent and we would sew from here all the way to the waist where the vent starts, and we would press our panel open, we could flip our vent over and we see that we have this strip folded in, which is going to be covered with lining, and we also have this shield which is big enough to cover the majority of our bum. Now let's get on with mark stitching and the lines we have to mark stitch. So let me just put all of this back to where it was and where it should be, and we can continue. So what are we going to mark stitch and what are we going to leave as it is? First of all, you have to know one thing about the back. We usually don't mark stitch the center back, whether it's a center vent or no vent or 700 vent, doesn't matter. The reason why we don't do that is because when we alter or make alterations to the center back, because the center back is the center of the garment, and so it's pretty much when sewn up, it's just one area, it's the same area. Any change we make to one panel, we make to the same. So we call that working on the double. And therefore, if we need, for example, we have, let's say, sewn this line and we need less roundness or we need more roundness, what we then do is just add a new basting line or a new sewing line and remove the other one. That's how we work. If you have mark stitches and you sew on top of mark stitches, either through the basting, the mark stitches may come out, or when you machine, the mark stitches get locked into the machining, and then what you get is basically headache from pulling out those mark stitches. On a center vent, however, because we have this opening, we don't baste it down. So there where we stop basting, we start mark stitching. That's how it goes for the center vent. If this wasn't a center vent, I would just baste all the way down for a fitting. And if it was a finished garment, then I would just baste and then machine. So now obviously we're going to do first a fitting. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to baste this. Okay, now that you know this about the center back, this is what we're going to do. We're going to sew just a quarter above the back neck, down along the center back to the point where the vent starts. From that point, we're going to mark stitch all the way down, mark stitch the hem, and then mark stitch, if you remember, a seam behind the edge of our pattern, which is going to be a continuation of the sewing line, basically. Then we have our hip line, waistline, chest line. Like I said, the chest line is the most important one. Then you have the waistline, the hip line. For this purpose, we're now going to mark stitch all of them so that we can look at them and talk about them if needed. There is a line here which is the top of the side seam, which you don't always need to mark, but I'm marking everything I should mark so that we can look at it, and if we need to refer to it, we can. And there is a pitch mark here, which is for the back pitch of the sleeve, which we also mark. These two you don't need to always mark. You definitely need to mark your balance lines, as in the chest line, the waistline, and your hip line, but the chest line is the most important. So then we have the back side, we have the back shoulder, and the back neck. These are going to be all mark stitch. Now let's start basting the center back and continue from there. And we're going to do that by using a running stitch. You can make a knot in the beginning and fasten on really well so it doesn't come undone. Now the reason is, you may ask, why do you not baste all the way from the top, but do you just start above the back neck? Well, the reason is that if we would do that, this is a lot of inlay that's just going to go into the neck, and so therefore it's going to create distortions around the neck, and it's not going to allow this to open up. So now this is all free. This can open up if there is any tightness around that area. Because remember, inlay will make things a bit tight. The more inlay, the more tightness you're going to create. Now, center back obviously is going to have a lot of pressure during fittings. In any case it's tight or you move too much. So we do a smaller baste and make sure that it's secure. What we're going to do is we're going to do 1, 2, 3, and we're going to pull. This will help us to speed up a little bit and sew a little bit faster, because every time we have to pull our thread, that takes time. Now imagine you do that 1,000,000 times throughout the day. 1,000,000 times 1/10 of a second is going to maybe give you an extra half an hour at the end of the day. And what you want to do is to save all your extra excessive hours so that you can pour them on the important parts of the garment, like the shoulders, sleeves, collar, pockets, anywhere where you need a lot of focus and finesse. Now I'm getting to the point where the vent is going to start, and so here I do 1, 2, and 3 back tacks. And what I also am going to do, just to hold the vent down, since I'm not going to press the seams open for now, I'm just going to go 1, 2, up, and then back tack there again. 1, 2, and 3. Make sure your bites are big when you're back tacking, because you want to take these out very easily. So you don't want to be messing around with your unpicker. You just want to get it through and unpick it when you have to. So this is just going to hold the vent down for me and give it a bit more stability. So from this point below, I'm going to start mark stitching and do the rest of the lines. I want you to focus for a second on here. I usually don't do this when I'm working for myself, but since that we are going to film this and I want you to kind of like be able to see what I'm looking at, I'm going to mark stitch the continuation of this edge as well, so that if I need to refer to it through the making process, then I can do that. But really the sewing line mark stitch is the one we are really going to need. Okay, so now another thing that I'm going to do, which I also want you to focus on, is, like I mentioned, when this opens up from this point, let me take a ruler for example. When the vent opens up, it opens up from this point. It's not going to open up like that. So if it opens up from this point, that means that I need most of my fabric shield to be at the bottom, and I don't need all of this extra piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this out so that I don't have to deal with it. So what I do is I just continue this line, and as soon as I hit the starting point of the vent, I kind of like trail off into the widest point that we have, like so, and that should be sufficient. So now we have our side vent and our back panel ready. All I need to do now is just open this up and get on with the rest. Okay, so once again, when you mark stitch it, expose the threads to some steam. This will make the fibers expand and set their claws into the fibers of the fabric. Now, also, please always, before you cut, I know I didn't do that here, but I'm kind of like used to doing what I'm doing, but always make sure before you cut through, flip it over, examine everything. Are all the points there? Until you really get used to it and it becomes second nature. After that, you can kind of like go with the flow and do the rest of the things that you need to do. Now we have a basting thread here, and I'll just show you now so that you don't get confused. But once you baste, let's say something like a center back for a base fitting, which is what we're going to do now first before we get to actually finish the garment, what you have to do is to lap the seam. And what that means is very simple. You just take your panel, you flip it over like so, and you can see now this is sewn together. In order to reinforce the seam, because it's only basted together and it's not like machined, what you do is you take a thread and you run a running stitch along the very edge of your seam to reinforce the previous stitching underneath. So, I mean, you don't need to keep this flat now. All you need to do is just to make sure that the inlays are all going to one side. All the inlays push to one side. You're not going to press it open. And what you do is get rid of all the excess. Make sure that you can lay this on flat and that nothing else is pulling or pushing or whatever. And just do a very fine basting close to the very edge so that it reinforces the previous stitching. Now, don't do this too far away from the edge because, hold on. Don't do this basting line too far away from the edge because that means you're going to hold a lot of the inlay, and the more inlay you hold onto your fabric, the more tightness it's going to cause. Allow the inlay to just move around freely if it wants to. So that's why I'm getting as close as I can to the edge, but not too close. You don't want to be felling your, basted edge. You just want it to be like, an eighth away from what the folded edge is. So as we get down, I can move this now, like so. Also, when you're basting, like I said before, don't pull your threads too much to create distortions like this. If you have the feeling that your thread is loose and you want to strengthen your thread, what you have to do is just put your finger down on the point where you started and just pull the thread a little bit, and that's just going to put the tension on the thread without pulling the fabric together. So this way it's going to hold everything down. Now, if you look at the vent, we have the mark stitch here and a mark stitch here right on this edge. This means that this mark stitch is the continuation of our sewing line. So what we have to do is to eventually crease along this mark stitch so that the two lines meet, and that's going to be the rest of the center back. The same thing is going to happen on our side seams when we have a side vent. When I get to the starting point of the vent, before I continue doing anything, I just do one back tack just to hold that down. Then what I'm going to do is make sure that everything is out of my way, so these two areas are flat. All the surplus is gone. Now, first thing I have to do is to crease along this mark stitching line. So I'll go ahead and do that as neatly as I can. And now that I've creased it, I'm going to align it with the mark stitch here, which is, basically the other panel along the same edge. So now it's as if I've sewn my center back all the way, like so. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, as this is all laying flat and this is in its place, I'm just going to sew across to hold down the rest of this inlay here, to hold down the rest of the inlay. Just like I did before. 1, 2, and I'm going through all the layers, and then do a back tack here and another one, and go back and fasten off once in the middle. So this is going to prevent the vent to just like move around whatever it wants to do, and it's just going to hold it there. So that's basically lapping a seam. Now what I have to do now is just to give this a press, and also what I want to show you is that now you can see that this area is open because we left it open. So when this goes around the back and around the neck, it can open up and not cause any tightnesses. So let's just give this a press. And try to smooth it out into the blades. Although I don't believe a lot in that nonsense of shaping backs, but I do have to press my center back. So now we have kind of like prepared our center back for the side center vent, and we also have our side vents. How are we going to do this is going to be in the next part. So let's move on to the sleeves now. All right, so we have our sleeves, and in this case we have our top sleeve. So again, let's just smooth this out and give this a warm welcome on the tailoring board. Now, one of the things that you notice with linen is linen moves a lot. I mean, this one is not that bad, but some of the linens, they just move, you know, it's like this point remains the same, but then 2 centimeters or 2 inches away from it, it goes all the way there. So what you need to do with linen is always make sure that as you're working on it, your grain is perfectly parallel to the board edge and, you know, perpendicular to that. And don't get like snake runs along the grain. So I'm just going to make sure that I have this sleeve positioned correctly and that all the edges, the raw edges, are matching, and we can start our mark stitching process. Now, you may see a line here. You can ignore that. That's just my bad marking. What are we going to mark stitch? Now, not every top sleeve that you are going to get has inlay on the top of the sleeve and on the hind arm. I put inlay on the top of the sleeve and on the hind arm because I like to make sure that the sleeve is in the most perfect way sewn to the armhole. So and also just to make things easier for myself, if for example we're going to do a pagoda shoulder and I want to add a little bit more extra roundness, which we call crown, to the top of the sleeve, I don't need to undo the sleeve, lay the pattern on top again, shift everything down just to get a bit more fabric. 1/2 inch is easy to work with. 3/4 can even work if the fabric is forgiving, and it's not a problem at all. Some people say, oh, this is so difficult to leave inlay. It really isn't, honestly, it isn't. You just have a lot more to play with and to be accurate, because sleeve shapes will make you go mad. And if you don't have enough fabric to make them exactly as they should be, you have to compromise, and then you end up with sleeves that, you know, have the grain going upwards, and you start to rotate sleeves in a weird way. But let's not go there for now. That's the dark side of tailoring. What are we going to mark stitch? Obviously, chest line. That's the first thing we're going to do. Then we also have the top of the sleeve and the hind arm all the way down. We stop at the cuff. We don't go all the way down. We stop at the cuff, and then we do the cuff hem, and that's pretty much it. These 2 chalk lines you can ignore. These are the balance marks of the other panels when I laid it out, and they have kind of like been transferred over to this piece. So let's get going with the sleeves. One of the things that I would mention in general is that as exciting as all of this may be, or as intimidating, or as confusing, or as fun and joyful, whatever mindset you have, and however you look at it, when you are in the beginning stages of what you're doing, don't just do things and get on with it. Focus on how you're doing things. So for example, when you're sewing, first of all, make sure that you know how to use the needle and the thimble before you do all of this. Like I said, master it so that when you do the mark stitching, all you need to do is to think about the mark stitching and all the other things that you're going to do. But still, as you're sewing, be conscious about your technique. Ask yourself, where is the needle now on my thimble? Am I pulling my fingers back far enough? Do I have the right needle for this job? Is there a better needle that I could use? Have I positioned everything correctly? And really examine what you're doing. Now, I'm not saying that you should be doing this to the point that you drive yourself mad and you paralyze yourself with fears because you're afraid of making mistakes. All you need to do is make mistakes, because your first jackets are going to be made for the bin. You should really seriously think about that, because as soon as you expect that you're going to make something really nice, even if you have instructions for it, and it doesn't happen, you're going to be so disappointed in yourself or in the person who gave you the instructions, or in the world, or you whatever. You don't want to get to that point. What you want to do is to consciously make the decision that your first few jackets are going to be made for your first customer, and that is the bin. The bin is your first customer, and you're going to make many jackets for your first customer until you get the hang of it and you really understand how you should examine your mistakes, where mistakes are kind of like okay, where they are fatal, let's say, to use dramatic words. And just jump into it. Don't be afraid or paralyzed with, oh, am I doing it the right way? Is this how all these ancient books and all these tailors do it? No tailor can. There aren't any tailors that I know that can agree on all the techniques that they use, and you're going to experience that as well. And you may not even agree with the techniques that you use yourself in like 10 years time. If I look back on the things that I did like even 1 year ago, let alone stand like 4 or 5 years ago, I constantly improve. So today I say I do it this way, and then I think about it a lot and I see how I can improve it, or I learn something from someone else, and I see how I can use that to my kind of like set of values, and just move on. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Just make that jacket, do the stitches, but at the same time be conscious of what you're doing. This way, when things do go wrong, you say, aha, that went wrong at the moment where I was using my thimble in this way, or when I was putting these two layers together before I did this, or prepared this or that. And make sure that you learn as efficiently as you can. That's one of the most important things to take away from, let's say, a video like this, is that, I'm giving you instructions to do things, but by no means are these instructions, the end of what you can achieve. Probably I would look at all of these videos in like 3 years time and say, oh man, I need to do this entire video series all over again, because, all of this is improved now since I made these videos. And so that's the feeling you're after. You don't want to say, okay, this is the way and I'm going to do this for 70 million years, because you're not going to grow, my friend. And growth is the main goal. Learn something and make sure you know the foundation, you know what should be there, what is objective, what is subjective, and improve. Now, it doesn't mean that you should be afraid of, following these instructions, because, I may improve them in like 2 years and then they're going to be obsolete. They're not going to be obsolete. They're going to teach you how to make your, how to start working on that thing that you want to work on, but you can't really find a teacher for it, or, afford the course because usually they are expensive. And just enjoy. One thing I have to say is that if you don't have inlay on the top sleeve, it's going to be no inlay all around except for the hem. So what you then do with the top sleeve is just this line. So you don't have all of this. People are going to say, oh, this is really bad. It takes so much time. If you know what you're doing, you don't need to leave inlays. And if you know what you're doing, you don't need to do all of this. It's extra time, blah, 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 blah. That's not the point. It's not the point what people say, because they have different criteria to what you have. And if you're going to work according to everybody else's criteria, then sometimes if you're lucky, you're surrounded with people who have very good criteria. But if you're not so lucky, and that's most of the time the case, you're surrounded with people who don't have a good criteria at all, and they have very different values and motivations from what you have. And so you need to be able to create your own criteria at some point. Of course, maybe in the very beginning you can't do that, but I'm sure that even in the very beginning, when you do something, you feel you want to improve it. Sometimes you look at something and like, I think I can do better than that. Let me just try. And you do it a couple of times and you're like, okay, I'm really happy that I did that, because I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. So make sure you have a reason for what you're doing, and don't get attached to that reason, because sometimes your reason may be just flawed, but makes sense in that time that you think of it. So if you do something and everybody's going to say, oh, you don't need to do this, or you don't need to do that, or this is too much, or this is what you need to do. Don't react to anything. Just think about what they're saying. Try to find out why they are saying you don't need to do this. So if someone's total, entire priority is time, then yes, this is all not necessary, because it takes time. But if your priority is having room to maneuver, then it's essential. So it's all very dependent on how you are viewing your work and how you want it to eventually end up. And the difficult part, I guess, which is always a struggle, and I never know how to explain this, but don't turn into a deconstruct tailor, everybody's got their own way, so whatever everybody's saying is wrong because they have their own way, because that's bullshit, There are fundamentals, there are pillars that we, base things on, and principles that we have to kind of follow. Otherwise, our work is not going to go together well. But there are certain things that are very personal. So if somebody tells you what you're doing is wrong, always ask why, and make sure that the reason they give you, first of all, is a reasonable reason. I know that sounds vague, but if they say, well, you just want to do it that way, well, that's not a good reason. But if they say, well, it's going to take you time, then don't say, oh, yes, it's going to take time. That makes perfect sense, so I'm not going to do it. Reflect and say, does time matter to me now? And if I wouldn't do it, would my work end up being better? So really ask some tough questions about that. Now we have done the top sleeve, and I'm just going to jump on the undersleeve. Okay, so undersleeve. Let's get the edges matching, just as we always do. And start our mark stitch. Now, what are we going to mark stitch? Very simple. Undersleeve run, hind arm. Well, sometimes you don't need to mark stitch this, because you mark the entire sleeve cuff according to the angle of the top sleeve. So the top sleeve will dictate this run once you've basted it together, as you're going to see. But if you want, you can do that. But I'm not going to do it, because for the reason that I'm going to show you later on in the series. Then chest line, which is our balance line. And that's it. Now, one thing I have to say about chest lines on top sleeves and especially on the sleeves is that because we're going to stretch out the forearm, as you're going to see later on when we get to make the sleeves, sometimes the angle of the two change and they won't match. But I still keep them there so that at least I know what changes to make to my pattern so that I do end up with the correct match when I get to make either another jacket or if I'm remarking and altering this. So it's always good to have all the references that you first calculate on your pattern and you finalize, and then adjust according to that. Okay, and that is our undersleeve, and this brings us to the last part of this video. Now, once we've done the mark stitching, what we then do is to go ahead and make up the different parts. The next thing I'm going to make is the canvases. So I'm definitely looking forward to that, and I hope that you do too.